Hello, Internet. Welcome to a new thing that we're doing called On My Shelf. I just made it up in the last 5 minutes, that title. Um, here's the thing. So we've been doing deleted scenes, and we'll get back to deleted scenes in the future. But for this summer, we're doing a special emphasis on prayer, and that'll involve a lot of talk about spiritual growth. There's a different tone to this summer, and we're hoping to get the church praying together, working together, and focusing on spiritual growth this summer. And so what I thought was, rather than doing my regular deleted scenes, I think what I want to do is spend this summer going through and basically books off of my shelf. And I want to open up to you some of my personal spiritual journey. For me, a lot of my spiritual journey involves reading books. And there are books that have really deeply touched me and formed me and made me think in particular ways. And several of them that were very influential on this particular sermon series. And a couple of them we now have in the church library, if you'd like to borrow them. And so I have a stack of books here. And basically what we're going to do, this isn't all of them, but there's some good ones in here. There's one on the 7 deadly sins. There's some N.T. Wright. My very first volume of Kierkegaard is in there. We've got the Book of Common Prayer, thick collection of C.S. Lewis. And these are some of the books that have really influenced me in my life. And so what I'm going to do each week is I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to introduce you to the books. And I don't expect everybody to go out and read these books as I'm going through them. Hopefully some of them will catch your eye and you might end up reading them yourselves. And there's a lot of different types of books and a lot of different levels of books in this stack, and at least one novel. But what I want to do, hopefully, is tell you what I learned from each one, so that even if you don't go read them, you can learn something from these different writers and who have formed me in my spiritual disciplines. And whenever I can, I'm going to connect the book that I'm talking about with the sermon that we just gave. And so where I want to start is this book that was recommended to me by a pastor friend in Wallowa County. It's called Spirituality for the Rest of Us by Larry Osborne. And originally it was published under the title A Contrarian's Guide to Knowing God. And this was a big eye-opening book for me. And I want to start with this because I think this is a great book for people who needed to hear Sunday's sermon. Sunday's sermon was about prayer pressure. And it was about how prayer is actually something that anyone can do. And we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to pray the right way, but that pressure is not coming from God. God wants us to grow and to learn in our time with him, but he doesn't expect that from us at the very beginning. This book was huge for me because it helped me to apply that to my overall journey in spiritual discipline and trying to get better at drawing close to God, because you very likely have had an experience like me where you try to get into spiritual disciplines, you try to get into regular prayer, you try and get into regular Bible study, and different commitments and habits and things like this, and you really struggle with them. And they'll go great for a while, and then you'll struggle, and then you'll lose track of them. And I just kept assuming that was my moral failure. I was failing to be a good, committed Christian, and I carried a lot of weight because of that feeling. And slowly I started to kind of get my bearings and not judge myself quite so harshly. But when I read this book, I loved it because Larry Osborne made an amazing point. And this is where I'm going to start with. I'm not going to cover everything that's in this book by any means, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a section that I think summarizes what he's saying, and then just a few really cool insights from this book. So if you have struggled with spiritual disciplines, if you've struggled with regular prayer, with commitments like that, I want you to listen to this. He says, the conventional paths to pleasing God seemed heavily tilted in the direction of certain personality types. The playing field didn't appear to be level. I wondered if God played favorites. On the one hand, I was told that spirituality was within the reach of everyone. On the other hand, I noticed that almost all of the books on spirituality and the inner life were written by introverts, smart ones at that. I got the distinct impression that God was somehow partial to reflective types with high IQs, impressive vocabularies, and lots of self-discipline. And that left a lot of us on the outside looking in. That's a huge realization for me. Here's what he's saying. He's saying that the spiritual disciplines that people write books about, and the big spiritual, the big figures in spiritual development that you read about, if you want to learn how to do all the fasting and praying and all these different things, they're always written by a particular personality type. And it's possible, it's very possible that if you that what they're describing is not the way to know God or the way to grow close to God, but a way to get close to God, and the way that works for their personality type. If you are highly self-disciplined, if you are introverted, if you are intelligent, if you love to read, if you're very reflective, then that's going to be great for you. But the truth is that that's not everybody. And we would expect, if that's not you and you try to be that way, you're going to run into problems. It's not going to work for you, right? What else would you expect? And so we don't have to assume that just because the normal spiritual disciplines aren't working for you, that you're not spiritual, or that you're not godly, or that you're not a good person. You might just not have that same personality. That's huge to me. It completely changes my perspective because it fits with what I've observed about the world. And here has been my tension, that when you talk about spiritual discipline, when you talk about getting close to God, you talk about these habits. You get this long list of habits of what it looks like to be a good Christian. But then I go out into the world and I think of the strong Christian people who have influenced me. And I don't know any of them that have mastered all of those. And some of them have not mastered any of them. I have known great Christian people who struggled all their lives to read the Bible regularly or to have a regular time in prayer. And yet they were still able to be good and godly people. Now, I'm not saying that prayer is meaning that you don't need prayer, or that you don't need Bible reading, or you don't need these spiritual disciplines in order to draw close to God. And that's not what Larry Osborne is saying either. But what I'm saying is that we don't have to assume that those things will come naturally to all of us. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad Christian if they don't come naturally to you. The next thing that he points out that I love is he uses this character of the cobbler of Corinth. Let me just so basically he's talking about what he calls leadership bias, which is that we tend to expect all Christians to behave like Christian leaders, or to be gifted like Christian leaders. And so we read the Bible and we read the New Testament, and we assume, like as you read Timothy, the books of Timothy and Titus in particular, that all Christians are supposed to end up like Timothy and Titus. But that's not actually an accurate picture of Paul's ministry. This is what he says. I'd always assumed that Timothy, Titus, Silas, and the rest of Paul's missionary partners represented the standard fruit of his ministry. I paid close attention to everything they did and every bit of instruction and advice Paul gave them. To my thinking, this represented what every Christian under my leadership needed to know and what they all ideally would become. But I was missing the blindingly obvious. Timothy and Titus were not the standard fruit of Paul's ministry. They were the rare and unusual. They were the next generation of leaders. The vast majority of the people Paul led to Christ, and the vast majority of people in the churches he planted, never became leaders or joined Paul in one of his missionary journeys. They were farmers and merchants, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters who quietly lived out changed lives through Christ. They included my cobbler in Corinth, a shoemaker who stopped visiting the temple prostitutes, became scrupulously honest in his business dealings, and treated his wife and children with a love and respect unknown in the pagan and Roman world. What Larry Osborne is doing in that passage is he's correcting our assumptions about who we're all called to be. We assume that we're all called to be leaders. We're all called to be Peters and Pauls and Jeremiahs and Isaiahs and Joshuas and Moses. And our culture teaches us that we're all supposed to be these, the stars of the movie. But there's a lot of pressure that comes in with that if you assume that you're supposed to end up like these Christian leaders. But the goal of the gospel is not to create a church full of leaders, is to create a church full of transformed lives, of people going about their everyday lives in transformed ways. And so that means that Paul's goal was to create these cobblers in Corinth, these people who went through their everyday lives and lived them in godly ways. And he recruited Titus's and Timothy's so that they could go out and create more cobblers. And so it's just this big mind change for me to realize that we're not all called to be these great warriors of the gospel. There are many who are, and we should always aspire to be everything that God made us, but there's no shame in the fact that God makes the majority of us to be these Christian people who are living out an everyday life in a God-shaped way. The next thing that he points out, I've got two more that are just huge insights from this book, and I highly recommend, if you're interested in what I'm saying, that you go and read this. He talks about blind spots and the fact that we all have these blind spots in our lives, that there are things that we just, huge things that we just simply don't see. And when we look at other people, we will see their blind spots and we'll wonder how, we'll condemn them, and we'll think, how could God possibly use those people? And we'll not recognize that we have our own blind spots. The example that he uses is Solomon. We know, if you know the story of Solomon, you know that there's a time when God appears to Solomon and asks him to request whatever he wants, and Solomon asks for wisdom, and God grants it to him, which is a very interesting story, and it becomes more interesting when you look at the location where it takes place. This conversation happens after Solomon has made a whole bunch of sacrifices on the high places. And that's interesting because the books of 1st, 2nd Kings are very clear that you're not supposed to sacrifice on the high places. It's a big no-no. And most of the kings, when that book summarizes their reign, it summarizes whether they're good or bad kings based on whether or not they use the high places. Solomon used them, but God still was willing to use Solomon. What that means is that God is willing to use us in our blind spots and to use others when they have blind spots. And so it doesn't mean that we are okay with our blind spots. We continually work to get better at them, but we don't have to be perfect for God to use us. And like I was saying yesterday about prayer, the way we find those blind spots is by being connected with God. And finally, the last one, this is another big one for me. He points out this concept of gift projection. And basically gift projection, oh man, this hit me hard. Gift projection is when we assume that every Christian is supposed to have the same gifts. And so we take the things that we're good at and we expect other people to be good at them too. Or we take the things that other people are good at and expect ourselves to be good at them. We assume that we're supposed to be as good as everyone at everything. And so let me read you, this is kind of a longer passage, but this resonates with me so strongly. He says, I once had some friends who were deeply involved in compassion ministries. They were committed to living a so-called simple lifestyle of low consumption, so their resources could be used to help those in far greater need. They loved to tell stories of personal sacrifice and seemed to favor the Old Testament prophets, especially those who spoke most sternly about God's concern for justice and mercy. Every time I was with them, I'd go home feeling like a loser for not selling my car, giving the money to the poor, and taking a bus. Another friend was a gifted evangelist. He constantly tried to motivate me and my other friends to share our faith as often and successfully as he did. He always had amazing stories of leading complete strangers to Christ. On an airplane, in a restaurant, in a taxi, waiting in line at the grocery store. It didn't matter where. Somehow he knew how to turn every conversation into a referendum on Jesus. He was absolutely certain that most non-Christians were just waiting for someone to invite them to follow Christ. He was convinced that if the rest of us cared, prayed and spoke out as boldly as he did, we too would see throngs coming to Christ. He also saw the rest of us as spiritual lightweights, unable or unwilling to join him in the only thing that had any eternal significance: evangelism. Now, the interesting thing about that passage, what he goes on to say, is that all of us have strong spots and weak spots. And so later on, he says, as I developed my own fledgling gifts of teaching and leadership, I found I could throw down some pretty good drive-by guiltings and gift projections of my own. I could nail my evangelist friend and the mercy types by playing up my long hours of study and my growing knowledge of the Bible. If they really loved God as much as they claimed, why weren't they spending as many hours as I was studying and memorizing large chunks of Scripture? How could they claim to be serious about the truth if they didn't grapple with the great theological questions of the day? Wouldn't someone who really loved God have an insatiable appetite for the word? Yes, he should have that hunger if he's been called to teach, but maybe not if he's been called to evangelize or work for justice and reconciliation. What he's saying is that we have some gifts. None of us have all the gifts, and that means that there are things that we do really well and things that we don't do really well. And in large part, that's okay. That we don't have to be as good at everything as anyone else is, right? So if you are gifted as an evangelist, that the only way you can be really gifted in evangelism is to take that time away from other spiritual gifts, right? You can't be constantly feeding the poor, constantly evangelizing, and constantly studying the Bible, or you don't have enough time to always be doing all of those things. And so God gifts us in different ways. And what that means is that if we have some gifts, we don't have others, and that's okay. I could just go on and on. I really highly recommend this book. This is one that we just got a copy for the library. And if you, like me, have struggled with the feeling that you were not a good Christian because you couldn't do Christianity the way all the major book authors seem to, I would recommend picking this up and reading it, because it's a breath of fresh air for me. Now, it's not permission to not grow, to not worry about where you're at. All of us have gifts that we need to develop. All of us have a relationship with God that we need to work on. But it does give you an encouragement to do it in a way that actually works for you. That's my episode for today. I hope this has been helpful. Feel free to ask us any questions down in the comments. And hope that we'll see you next week in service. And remember that you can listen to the sermon and download the worksheet on our website. And I'm trying to remember which book I'm going to do next week. Next week is on praying to, oh, yes, next week. No, I'm sorry. Next week, we're going to do the second book that inspired this prayer series, which is a book called Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home by Richard J. Foster. So we'll talk about that next week. I hope to see you at church and see you back here online. Thanks so much.